Hey, this is Gary.
This is Mike.
And Daniel. We're not professionals. We're just three addicts sharing our experiences, strength, and hope regarding recovery.
Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to other addicts and to practice these principles in our lives.
Welcome to another episode of the 12th Step Podcast. My name is Gary.
And this is Mike.
And this is Daniel.
Well, hello, guys. Are you ready for another one?
Yes.
Absolutely.
All right. So tonight we're going to be answering another one of our listeners' emails. And this one has a lot going on. So
yeah,
let's just jump right into it. Okay, it says, first off, I just want to say that your guys' podcast has helped me immensely. Thank you for all that you do. You are most welcome. And we are very grateful that you trust us enough and to reach out and interact with us. And
yes.
So let's see what we can do for you. My situation is as follows. I've been a porn addict for the majority of my life. My brother who sexually assaulted me as a little boy was the same person who introduced me to pornography and taught me how to masturbate. For whatever reason, I finally admitted to my wife when she asked me if I was struggling with pornography. Keep in mind that this was probably the 8th time that she'd asked me in our almost 4 years of marriage. When it first came out, I lied about how often and how long I have struggled with it, and I told her a half-truth. And then a couple of days later, I admitted to looking at it for the last 2 years. At that time, I wasn't thinking about our whole relationship, including dating and engaged time periods. With a couple of weeks gone by, I acted out in the shower because I missed the feeling of masturbation and wasn't looking at anything or thinking of anyone, and I stopped right before climax. I didn't think I had done anything wrong, so I didn't tell my wife about that even when she asked if I had done anything, and I started realizing that it was wrong, and I admitted that I had done what I had done 2 weeks later. That causes her to start doing some investigation of her own, and she found some apps that I had when we were engaged, which means yet again, she's traumatized. All over for the 3rd time, she asked me to tell her everything that I had ever lied about, which seemed like a hasty full disclosure. I didn't want to do a full disclosure without a trained therapist because I knew it wouldn't be done correctly. So, of course, a full disclosure happened, and she was made aware of everything that I could remember. And I am now separated from my wife, going on a month now. I am attending a 12-step group, and I have just completed my first step. I am going to therapy. I have a sponsor, and I'm doing daily calls to help with my recovery. My wife is now telling me that she has no desire to go to partner betrayed groups and doesn't have any energy to do anything except not resent me. She's told me she's heavily leaning toward divorce and it will be any day now that she finally makes that decision, which is her right. She doesn't want to seek any help or go to therapy. She doesn't have anyone that is speaking into her life and helping her with this. I guess my intention with this email is to ask what happens when a spouse doesn't put any effort into healing her own situation. Let me know, guys. Thank you for all you do. E. Well, before we jump into your last question about what happens, let's talk a little bit about your experience and what you have going on here. If for no other reason than maybe for the benefit of some of our other listeners. You're right when you point out that this staggered disclosure is a re-traumatizing kind of event.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting that we all sort of clued in on that. That was the first thing I thought of was just, wow, this is sort of a relive trauma every couple of days as new information comes out. How difficult that must have been. That staggered disclosure stuff is very difficult.
Now, having said that, and that's absolutely true, that's a little bit like Somebody compared it once for me, like, if you have a dog or a sheep or somebody where you dock the tail, you cut the tail off. That's like doing it a little bit at a time, thinking you're being merciful.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you're just making them go through the same thing over and over again. Now, having said that, that's a less than ideal way to do it. I'm pretty sure that pretty much everybody here on the podcast did a little bit of that.
Yes.
Staggered disclosure.
I know
kind
I
of
did.
Stuff. Yeah, I know I did. I can.
I was going to say that I'm not entirely certain that anybody hasn't. Right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
Well, and not only
I
that,
think that anybody who's working any kind of recovery at all. So I guess the point of it is these things are never perfect.
No.
So if we think that for some reason, that somehow, some way, that it's got to be a perfect scenario for us to really sit down and disclose, it just doesn't happen that way.
correct.
Thankfully, that there are, in my own condition, as botched as my disclosures went with my wife, gratefully she was willing to stick it out and stay with me, and I'm a benefactor of her goodness and her kindness, because there's no doubt about it that she had all the right and reason to leave.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that it's different in every circumstance, and I know that, but I do know from an addict's perspective, I have a hard time believing that there's ever any disclosure that goes absolutely as planned.
Oh,
No.
yeah.
No. Well, not only that, there's a lot of justification that was going on where he's like, well, I didn't orgasm, so I didn't bother telling her. Well, if this was one of the things that was, that she's gets upset about, you should have told her. But at the same time, I'm pretty sure that he's like, wow, but I don't want to get into another argument. I don't want to get into a fight. So there's some fear jumping in there. That's our addict fully at play, saying, no, don't say anything. Let's just sweep it under the rug.
Right.
We're okay. But then it always comes back and bites us in the butt.
In the worst possible time.
Yes.
Go ahead, Mike.
It really does. I'm going to jump in here, though, also, and one of the things that's very clear to me as he is giving this description about what's going on, I come back to the writing in Sage 1, the book talking about the fact that we've done absolute damage to our brain.
Oh yeah.
I know from my own experiences, and as I'm empathizing with him as he's talking about his circumstance and how, every time a disclosure came out to share this or share that, and hey, I didn't think about this, and I wasn't thinking about that, and hey, I didn't ejaculate. I mean, I masturbated, but I didn't ejaculate. These are, in a lot of cases, these are damaged minds. These are damaged brains. We're not thinking normally. We're not thinking right-like. And so when we're put in these circumstances, I know this happened to me an awful lot. We're put in these circumstances of, hey, what about this? What about that? I'm like, I never really thought of it that way. You're right. So he's coming from a place of damage. Yeah.
No, and I always found in these situations where I was confronted, how I related is my memory, my brain is like this Jenga tower. And when someone comes and confronts me about it, that's like they took the bottom three pieces and yanked them out. And so all the connections to how to get to those answers is now just scattered everywhere, and I can't get to them properly. Because you're right, my brain is damaged. It doesn't know how to compute all that information when I'm in that panic, trauma, or whatever mode you want to call it. Because you kind of go into that same kind of mind frame that they've already experienced when they've discovered it. And so you can't, when they're bombarding you with questions, you just can't get to that answer fast enough. And it's a lot better if you just go to them after it's happened and say, hey, this happened, because you can get to those answers.
Yeah.
And you're not in that panic state. And if they ask you more questions, you can get to the right locations.
As a rule of thumb, I always say you have 24 hours.
Yeah.
If a lapse or a relapse happens, you have maximum 24 hours before you're keeping a secret.
Yeah.
The other thing that I wanted to point out is you said that she went through this trauma at least 3 times, and reality of it is there was probably a little bit more.
Probably a lot more.
Probably
if she's gotten to the point of I'm done.
Yeah, but I'll tell you a little bit about my experience. So my wife had her suspicions, and I would deny it, and then she'd find out a little something, and then I'd kind of cop to what I was busted to, and that continued to escalate. And then she found out that I had an affair, and I had copped to that, and then then it escalated until the night that I attempted suicide, and she went to the hospital, and finally I fully disclosed everything. But by that time, I had trained her to expect the other shoe to fall so often that when I finally did do the full disclosure, and I was in the same situation. My wife and I were separated, and for some time after, I got out of the hospital, I went back to my parents' home, and she watched me really, really close. And for a very, very long time, she expected something more, something more. And I didn't like it. And sometimes I was frustrated and irritating, but I understood that for years I had created this pattern, and that's really all she knew. And then to find out that she was right all along. And now I'm asking her to believe me again. It took a long time for her before she would take me at my word. I mean, she would listen to me, and a lot of times she'd want to believe it. It was like trust but verify.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that for a long time. So given the circumstances, I can understand a little bit about her behavior,
Yeah, I mean, it honestly sounds like right now, like you said, she's trained to the point that, okay, there's another shoe that's going to drop.
Yeah.
When is it going to drop?
And what's it going to look like?
What's it going to look like? You're like, hey, I'm getting better. The disclosure is going to happen. Or it has, excuse me. She needs to see that when you say things are good, they stay that way, that other shoe doesn't drop again, and that she can verify over and over that that's the new pattern that's in place instead of the old pattern where, okay, I start feeling comfortable and then the shoe drops again, and then I have to start all over.
The other thing that you need to understand is that people, okay, our mind is very, very good at learning what it needs to pay attention to and what it can ignore. Okay, so you can think a little bit of it. It builds a map or a picture, a kind of a model of the world around it. So it's not really interacting with the world per se. It's got a model in its head, and then in your head, and then it chooses what it needs to pay attention to. So why this kind of thing is so traumatic for people is they find out that their model is wrong, their reference is wrong, because you're not who you're supposed to be. You're not who you've said you were. You found out all of these things, and that literally turns people upside down. And that's why you'll hear, maybe you guys have heard this kind of stuff, but you'll hear things like, I don't even know who you are.
Yep.
I can't believe anything you said. My whole life has been a lie. And that's because their frame of reference, because they'll say to themselves, oh, I was wrong about him. And not only was I wrong, I was really wrong. And if I'm wrong about him, maybe I'm wrong about all my relationships. And maybe if I'm wrong about that, maybe I'm wrong about everything. And it can kind of cascade, and you really turn their whole world upside down. So it's not surprising when they have a hard time, because they've got to rebuild and reorient themselves and try to start figuring some of this stuff out. And during this time, they'll watch very, very carefully, which is sometimes why that distance is needed and things like that. Now, right now, when she says, I don't have any energy except not to resent you, in that situation, that's a lot of resources. And sometimes in my experience, I learned that there were certain problems that I had to deal with, and I knew that I had to deal with them, but I had to gain a certain level of mental health before I had the resources to deal with it. I remember there was one thing in particular where, as part of my addiction, I used to kind of hoard things and kind of pack things away in my basement and I knew that I had to go clean all that stuff out. But it took me 3 years before I was ready to do that. And then I went and did it, but it took that long. So I'm not surprised to hear her say something like, all I have is energy to do that. Now, that doesn't mean that she's not going to go to her own kind of recovery, and eventually she'd be very wise to do so. She would also be wise to get some people who could listen to her and things like that. But you can't You can't force that kind of thing on anybody, and they have to be willing and ready to do it.
And another
Which, Gary,
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say, I think which hits exactly that last paragraph, saying, well, what happens when a spouse doesn't put her effort into getting or healing on her own situation? And I think that's that comment comes up in almost every email that we receive from anybody, as though we have the ability to impose our will and desire on the other half of this, or the other relationships that are affected by this addiction. And that is that I want to impose on my spouse to say, look, I know I've introduced this problem into our marriage, and I'm damaged, which means you're by definition are damaged, because you had to create some amount of crazy to deal with my crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Now I want you to go get fixed, as though we have that kind of control and we have that kind of responsibility. And unfortunately, we just simply don't.
Yeah.
Part of the healing process is the realization, again, knowing full well where I end, that someone else begins. Not only in protection of my own self, but in recognizing the power and influence that I have over another. It is not healthy to assume, it's not a healthy thing at all, ever, to assume that I have the ability to encourage or enforce or coerce another human being to do something they don't necessarily want to do. And that's literally what we've got. We've got a spouse who's saying, this is your deal, this is your problem, I'm not, and all I have is the energy to resent you and to hate you. And I have to be okay with that. That's really, really hard, even in a healthy environment, let alone an addictive environment.
Yeah.
That's really, really hard to say, I'm way okay with you being resentful, and you do what you do and let it go.
And one thing I would say is maybe, quit worrying about her right now. Focus on you. Get into a good place. And maybe with that change, she starts seeing that shoe isn't going to drop. You are working on your recovery. You are getting in a better place. Maybe she'll go, okay, I'm seeing some improvement. I'm seeing proof that he's actually not falling back on old behaviors. That shoe isn't dropping. Maybe I need to go seek some help. Mm-hmm. But you can't force that. That has to be a choice of her own.
I also want to point out that pretty much every step in the 12 step has a step preceding it that says, I'm going to become willing to do the next step.
Yep.
Okay. So just because right now she's not going to therapy, or she's
not willing to do that,
doesn't mean that she's not working on becoming willing.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So that's always fascinated me about the 12-step program is, I'm going to become willing to do this, and now I'm going to do it. And then I'm going to become willing to do this, and now I'm going to do it. And we need to remember that we have to allow that same process to take place in other people. Right now, she's working on becoming willing to do that.
Yeah.
So
willing to forgive you, willing to move forward, willing to get help on her own.
And a thing that would work in direct opposition of that is trying to force them to. Mm-hmm. I mean, imagine, how well does that work when spouses try to force addicts to quit their addiction when they're not willing to? It doesn't, so the reverse is also true. So the very best thing that you can do is remember that your recovery is about you, and you need to do it for you. And regardless of what happens, you do the work, you do your recovery, you go through the steps, you do your therapy, and allow her to see that.
Yeah. And
I don't think she's interested in us telling her about it.
No.
My experience in any of this is that my words have no meaning anymore. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can see your lips moving, but I can't understand a word of what you're saying. I think is how that all goes at this point in time, simply because I've said so much in the past. No, I'm a changed individual, and I wasn't. So I think the key message that you just stated there is that now I start demonstrating through my behaviors that I'm a changed individual, that I'm recovering.
Well, I mean, even in his email, he's proven that his word is not good to her.
Sure.
Because, as he said, he just kept saying, nope, I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with that. And then I finally told her I had a problem. And then I told her, then I only told her a partial truth about it. And then I told her later. So your words to her can't be trusted. So the only thing that can be, it's been said, is your actions.
Mm-hmm.
So if you do that enough, she'll see that, realize that other shoe isn't going to drop, and then, when her nervous system can calm down enough, then she might go, okay, he's getting better. Maybe there's some things I'm adding, to the mix of this. And then she may reach out to a therapist. She may find a woman's group or a spouse's group or even a therapist to help out. But she needs to get her system calmed down. And as long as you're continuing to poke the bear, she's never going to get to that point.
Right. If you want somebody to trust you, this is a good way to look at it. There's only two things you can do. You can trust them and be trustworthy. The rest is up to somebody else. Then they get to decide whether to trust you or not. So, you need to start exercising those things. If you want her to trust you, give her some truth to work with, and let her see that. Don't tell her that. Actually show it to her with your actions, And, there's what's called the transfer of vigilance. My wife kept expecting the other shoe to fall, and she kept doing that until for long enough time, I took the extra action of going out of my way to demonstrate that wasn't going to happen, And what that looked like is up until then, she'd make my doctor's appointments and things like that. But no, now I made my therapy appointments and I kept them.
Yeah.
And I didn't have to be told to do so. I said, okay, I will do this. And then I would do it, and I did that consistently, even in little things. You have to learn to become impeccable with your words so that everything you say actually has meaning, and you need to back that up, that your words and your deeds have to align. And that takes some practice.
Yeah.
That really does take some practice coming from an addictive behavior. That's where you've spent, in my case, it's spent years, tens and 20s of years to hide and to escape and to all those sorts of things. That's it's almost as though you're retraining your brain to behave in a certain way and to think a certain way. And I think that's relevant. I think that's absolutely relevant to recognize the fact that this stuff isn't coming to me naturally the way it would a normal, healthy human. When I do say I'm going to go do something, I go do it.
Yeah.
So.
All right. I think we got this covered.
All right. Fantastic. Well, so I will address your question. Okay. So you say here at the end, what happens when the spouse doesn't put any effort into getting healing for their own situation? Well, then healing is really, really hard. But I will tell you, in my experience with recovery, relationships do one of two things. They either get better or they end.
Mm-hmm.
So give her some grace, give her, let her work her process, you work yours.
And there's three of us here. 2 out of 3, it got better. The one, it ended. So the odds are in your favor.
At least from this sample size.
Yes, from this sample size. I would say in most sample size. I mean, at least from what I've seen out of the SAGE groups that we've attended, most of the relationships do get better.
For the people who genuinely do the work.
Yeah.
Most of my experience is that things have gotten better.
And it takes you doing the work first, not waiting for her. You take the lead.
For those that don't do the work, they always seem to get worse.
Yes. Yes, that's the truth. All right. Is that everything?
I think so.
We're good. You started this.
I did start this, but I had one other thought. We just said if you do the work, things will get better. But remember that the other person gets a vote too.
Yes.
And it is absolutely possible that you can do everything right and it can still fail.
Yeah.
And because the other person gets a vote, and that's the reality that you have to accept. Now I hope that that's not what's going to happen in your case, but that's why we always say that your recovery has to be for you. is because you can't do it for anybody else. Because if you are and it doesn't meet your expectations or things don't work out, then you're just going to collapse. So good luck. We're rooting for you. And with that, I'm going to say, do the next right thing.
And this is Mike saying, doing the work necessary to find the peace that recovery can bring.
And this is Daniel saying, even if it does end, you might find your life even better than it was before.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like this episode, please give us a 5-star rating on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find us.
As a fellowship of recovering addicts, Sex Addicts Anonymous offers a message of hope to anyone who suffers from sex addiction. Check out saa-recovery.org.